In just over 100 years, from about 1800 to 1914, Europe went from controlling less than 35% of the world's land to over 84%, taking just 4 more decades to get to 90%. In this time, Europeans stole almost the entirety of the world. And one of the most insane parts of this is that the last big chunk of land still left unconquered by Europe was Africa. So how did Europe steal Africa so quickly? Well, that's what we're going to map today. Okay, so first of all, let's look at our first map, which shows us the state of the world in 1800. Europe had managed to conquer quite a lot of land already, including huge areas of North and South America, Australia, and large parts of Asia. But despite all of this, they only controlled around 35% of the Earth's total landmass. The vast majority of the world's land remained outside of European control. Most of this was in Asia and Africa, but also there were some bits here and there, like Alaska being owned by Russia or the various independent states in the Pacific. As we move into the early 20th century, though, and see the world in 1914, we can see that things have dramatically changed. Now, over 84% of the world is owned by European powers, with almost all of this land being gained from either Africa or Asia. What's really interesting is that although Europe had conquered a ton of land in both of these regions, somehow Africa was still free. This wouldn't last for long, though, as just over a decade before this map was made, Europe got together and decided how they would divide up the African continent between them. To understand why and how Europe was able to steal Africa so quickly, we need to go back to 1884. By this point, European powers had been conquering and colonizing large parts of the world for decades already. They'd carved up the Americas, they'd fought multiple wars over islands in the Pacific, and they'd taken huge chunks out of Asia, and so now they were turning their attention to Africa. The first thing to note is that although the European powers are often painted as great rivals and enemies, at this point they were generally actually working together. Britain and France, who would later be fighting over Egypt, were sitting at the same table and working together. Germany and Austria-Hungary, who would fight against each other in World War I, were also at the same table. Even Russia, who would later lose millions of people fighting against the Ottoman Empire alongside Britain and France, was at this conference working with their supposed enemies. This shows us that the European powers weren't really friends, but they weren't mortal enemies either. At this point, their main goal was simply to carve up Africa, and they needed to work together to do this. Now, you may think that this was because they couldn't conquer Africa without help. And while that might have been true 50 years earlier, by 1884, European powers could easily have tried to conquer Africa on their own. The reality was that they had way more interest in dividing Africa up than actually conquering it. What they wanted to do was make sure that no other European power would stop them from conquering the riches of Africa. One of the first things that we need to know about the Berlin Conference is that it didn't actually conquer Africa. The African leaders and rulers weren't invited to this conference, and so they weren't asked for permission or told anything that was going on. They were simply informed that their continent had just been handed over to European powers. The Berlin Conference was essentially a meeting between European powers and was hosted by Otto von Bismarck, the leader of Germany. He had organized this conference because he wanted to prevent war between the European powers whilst they were carving up Africa. He hoped that by holding this conference and creating rules about how Africa would be divided, the European powers would stay out of each other's way and just focus on conquering Africa. There were 14 rules created at the conference, but most of these were just ways to stop the European powers from fighting each other. For example, the first rule stipulated that any power wanting to claim land in Africa needed to notify the other European powers so that they could stop them from claiming too much land. The second rule basically said that no European power could claim land if they didn't actually control it. And Rule 7 said that if there was ever a dispute between two European powers about land in Africa, then the other powers would mediate the argument. Essentially, these rules were created to keep the peace, and they were only concerned with giving European powers easy access to Africa and preventing them from fighting over it. None of these rules actually helped the Africans, and that was kind of the point. During the conference, there were heated arguments about how to divide Africa up, and the interests of the Africans weren't considered at all. The main question that the European powers were asking was, how can we make sure that we all get as much of Africa as possible? To answer this question, the European powers agreed to ignore the many different ethnic groups, countries, and kingdoms in Africa and just drew lines across the continent, handing over huge areas of land to European powers, regardless of who lived there and without asking anyone for permission. For example, in present-day Nigeria, there are hundreds of different ethnic groups and smaller kingdoms. But the European powers didn't care about any of this. They simply drew a line, arbitrarily deciding where Nigeria would end and British Cameroon would start. In another example, the European powers gave over half of the Congo River basin to Belgium, despite the fact that none of its borders made sense. It didn't include any major cities, resources, or even any people. They just drew a line because they could, and because it meant that Belgium would be less likely to fight with other European powers over its new, huge area of land in Africa. After the conference, the European powers were free to race across Africa and claim as much land as they could. And boy, did they do that. They do. Just 10 years after the conference, Morocco had lost 2/3 of its territory to Spain and France. Also, in West Africa, the British took control of the entire region between the Niger and the Benue rivers, taking lands that were inhabited by hundreds of different ethnic groups and kingdoms. Then, further south, we can see that huge areas of land were claimed by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. One of the most interesting parts of this scramble for Africa is that it was incredibly quick. The entire process happened within just a few years. And once again, this was mostly because the European powers were less interested in ruling over Africa and more interested in making sure that other European powers could not rule over Africa. As soon as the conference ended, every single European power started racing across Africa, taking as much land as they could. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is that somehow Italy wasn't involved. Throughout all of this, Italy had been watching as the other European powers took huge areas of land in Africa. Realizing that they would get nothing if they didn't act, they sent an army to the small region of Eritrea on the coast of the Red Sea. They defeated the local ruler and claimed Eritrea for Italy. A little while later, they also conquered the island of Sicily from the Ottoman Empire and were given Libya by the Ottomans. Somehow, despite being one of the largest European powers, they hadn't managed to carve out any land in mainland Africa. And so now we can take a look at our final map, which shows us the world in 1914. Europe had managed to increase their share of the world's land from 35% to over 84%. The vast majority of this land had come from Africa, with Europe stealing 90% of the continent. As we zoom into Africa, we can see just how dramatically the continent has changed. Hundreds of independent kingdoms and ethnic groups had been completely wiped off the map and replaced with arbitrary borders that didn't take into account any ethnic or geographic borders. The African continent, which had been home to humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, was now fully under the control of European powers. Europe had managed to steal Africa in just a few short years, and it would be another 50 years before many African nations would win their independence. Anyway, that is our video. If you like this video, please leave a like. If you love this sort of content, consider becoming a member. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.